Well, good morning, everyone. Eric, I'm John Marshak with the State Water Board, and the concepts we're going to cover today are how to select numeric limits to protect the beneficial uses of our water resources in California. It is affected by our main California water quality statute, the Port Cologne Water Quality Control Act. We're going to talk about water quality standards and what that term means and how it's used in California. State and regional water board plans and policies factor prominently in the interpretation of water quality standards for California. For today are statutes, regulations, plans, and policies that relate to water quality standards in California. We're going to implement narrative water quality objectives using numeric thresholds from other organizations and the peer-reviewed literature. Some water quality goals tools to you. There is a staff report that explains water quality standards and how they're used in California. And there's also an online database and other online resources to help you to interpret those standards for specific purposes. In those tools are a number of algorithms to help you select water quality assessment thresholds in a defensible manner. The term water quality standards actually is not found in California statute or regulation. It's a federal term from the Federal Clean Water Act, and water boards in California have delegated authority to implement the Clean Water Act within our state. Water quality standards are provisions of either state or federal law that do two things: defining uses of the United States and water quality criteria to protect those uses. California, the water quality standards are found in the water quality control plans adopted by the state and regional water boards. Regionally adopted water control plans are often called Basin plans because they apply to a large water quality basin within California. Water standards include three things in California: beneficial use designations. So each water body is assigned certain uses that must be protected. Sometimes uses are assigned only to a portion of a water body, for example, a particular reach of a stream or river. And there are water quality objectives, the criteria to protect those uses. California law requires that whenever we have water quality objectives, we have implementation programs to achieve those objectives. You'll have these in the water quality control plans or basin plans. Beneficial uses of waters of the state are defined in Port Cologne as uses that may be protected against water quality degradation, and a number of examples are provided in the definition, including various kinds of water supply, generation, recreation, aesthetic enjoyment, navigation, and the preservation and enhancement of fish, wildlife, and other aquatic resources and preserves. The regional water boards assigns one or more of these uses to each body of water within their regions. And you'll have those designations in the water quality control plans. This part of water quality standards are the water quality objectives, with limits or levels of water quality constituents or characteristics established for the reasonable protection of beneficial uses of water or prevention of nuisance. The word reasonable protection. Reasonable appears a number of times in California water law. The implementation of our standards is done in a way that's reasonable to achieve. So water boards adopt a new water quality objective. They have to make a finding the objective is reasonable to achieve. Once the objective has been adopted, then that determination has been made and compliance with those standards are required. Objectives come in two forms. They're either numeric, specifying a concentration limit, for example, or narrative, describing a requirement in more general terms, or prohibiting a condition that's harmful to beneficial uses. example of one of the very common narrative water quality objectives found in the Central Valley region water quality control plans, but also you'll find a very similar objective in nearly all of the water quality control plans in California. This one is the chemical constituents objective, and essentially says that we cannot have chemical constituents in concentrations that adversely affect beneficial uses. For example, a way to implement this would be if someone were to discharge boron to a creek, that boron may affect the ability of that water to be used to irrigate crops because boron can be harmful to plants. That would be a violation of this narrative water quality objective. Part of this objective says that at minimum, water designated as municipal or domestic water supply have to meet California's drinking water standards. Those water standards are adopted by the State Department of Public Health and found in Title 22 of the California Code of Regulations. But in order to protect all beneficial uses, the regional water boards may apply limits that are more stringent than the drinking water maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs. A very common narrative water quality objective found in the water quality control plans is one for toxicity. It essentially says we can't have any toxic chemicals in toxic amounts. To interpret this, you have to know what the beneficial uses are that have been assigned to the water body. So, for example, if it's municipal or domestic supply, we're talking toxicity to humans. If it's agricultural supply, it might be toxicity to crops or livestock. If the beneficial use is protection of aquatic organisms, then it's toxicity to aquatic life. And this objective applies regardless of whether the toxicity is caused by a single toxic substance in the water or the interactive effects of multiple toxic substances together. A common narrative water quality objective found in our water quality control plans is one that prevents adverse tastes or odors in water. She says that we cannot have adverse taste or odor-producing substances in concentrations that impart undesirable tastes or odors to water supplies, to fish flesh, cause nuisance, or otherwise adversely affect beneficial uses. These are broad water quality objectives that give the water boards quite extensive authority to protect the beneficial uses of our water resources in California. Example of where taste and odor might be more limiting. Here are 3 chemicals that are found in gasoline. Gasoline additive, MTBE. Here in the middle are toxicity-related concentrations of these gasoline constituents in water. Above these levels, there may be toxicity problems, toxic effects on humans. And these are California's primary drinking water maximum contaminant levels adopted by the State Health Department. On the side are concentrations of these chemicals in water that would make the water taste bad or smell bad to a significant number of people. You can see that water might be rendered unpalatable at much lower concentrations for these chemicals than it would be rendered toxic. The water has the authority to require that we have no adverse tastes or odors, so these lower taste and odor thresholds could be used as enforceable limits to protect beneficial uses of California's waters. Into the water quality objectives in our basin plans, there are another set of criteria that apply numeric limits to our waters. Under the Federal Clean Water Act, all states are required to have enforceable numeric water quality criteria for a set of chemicals called priority toxic pollutants. California did not have a sufficient number of these chemicals covered in our water quality control plans, so in 1992, this Environmental Protection Agency adopted a rule, national rule, called the National Toxics Rule, in order to establish enforceable numeric criteria for waters in California and many other states as well. The Toxics Rule was adopted by US EPA in 2000. that added additional California Toxics Rule criteria for California waters. So all for priority toxic pollutant chemicals in water, they are enforceable as the water quality objectives in the basin plans. Scenarios for quality standards in California. We have the water quality objectives plus the beneficial use designations in the basin plans to get those to make enforceable water quality standards. We also have either California Toxics Rule or National Toxics Rule water quality criteria, and when combined with the beneficial use designations in our basin plans, we also have enforceable water quality standards. So 2 ways to get standards in California. A number of the regional water boards have adopted policies for how water quality objectives are applied within their regions. The Central Valley region has 2 basin plans, and both of those plans have policies for application of water quality objectives. The San Francisco Bay region also has such a policy, as do a number of other regions. In the Central Valley, there's specific language that says how narrative water quality objectives are to be implemented. This states that they're to be implemented with numeric limits, orders adopted by the board. So, for example, a permit to allow someone to discharge waste to waters of the state required to have numeric limits that are based on narrative water quality objectives, in addition to the numeric water quality objectives and the CTR and NTR water quality criteria. Compliance with narrative objectives is to be evaluated using direct evidence of a beneficial use impact, such as a fish kill, or all material and relevant information submitted by the discharger of waste or other interested parties, and relevant numeric criteria and guidelines from other agencies and organizations. And a reference document, a collation of water quality goals, is cited in this policy as one source of these relevant numeric criteria and guidelines that are used to implement narrative water quality objectives. It goes on to say in the San Francisco Bay region that to evaluate compliance, we have a very similar situation. All relevant and scientifically valid evidence is to be included, as well as numeric criteria and guidelines developed and or published by other agencies and organizations. And again, this region references a compilation of water quality goals as one place to find those relevant criteria and guidelines. So goals of regional board policies for implementing narrative water quality objectives. If you take all this together, what does it really mean? What are the minimum levels and maximum levels of constituents in water that are legally allowable under standards? The way objectives, California Toxics Rule and National Toxics Rule criteria together define the least stringent limits that will be imposed on water in the stream, lake, river, or the groundwater. Net background concentrations define the most stringent limits imposed on what we call ambient water quality. Again, the quality of water in the stream, the river, the lake, or in the groundwater aquifer. And this comes from a couple of different policies established by the State Water Board, the degradation policy, and the site assessment and cleanup policy. So here is a way to show these minimum and maximum levels. So their quality standards are maximum concentrations of constituents in water that can be allowed under our standards. Natural background levels are the lowest levels that will be allowed. Notice that 0 is not part of that equation. No concentration at all is not consistent with our water quality standards. However, anti-degradation principles can lead the regional water boards to adopt limits in permit, for example, that are lower than this range. But in most cases, natural background levels provide the least stringent levels that will be used in a permit or other action by the water boards. sent a spreadsheet to you, or a flow chart rather, that shows the thought process that would go into how to determine numeric limits in water in compliance with all of these concepts: water quality objectives, water quality standards, CTR and NTR criteria, the water quality control plans or basin plans. So two different situations. Either somebody proposes a new discharge that might affect the quality of water, or it's been an existing discharge and we want to find out has that impaired beneficial uses of water. So we need site-specific information and pollutant-specific information about the discharge. First of all, what bodies of water either have been affected or may be affected by that discharge. Next, we look at the quality standards from the water quality control plans and the California Toxics Rule and the National Toxics Rule criteria. What are the official uses of the bodies of water of interest here? What are the quality objectives and promulgated criteria to protect those uses under the basin plans and the CTR and the NTR? As I mentioned, some of those are numeric and are narrative. The water quality objectives may be interpreted using numeric thresholds published by other agencies and organizations and the peer-reviewed literature. So for each constituent of concern, there may be a number of limits that would be applicable. Numeric water quality objectives and criteria from the NTR and the CTR would apply. In addition, there may be other numeric thresholds to implement each of the narrative water quality objectives that applies. Of that group of thresholds, the limiting would implement all applicable water quality objectives and promulgated criteria, and that would normally govern the threshold for that particular constituent in that body of water. In other words, if that concentration were exceeded, there would be a violation. However, natural background levels come into play as well. If the natural concentration of the particular substance in that water is higher than the numeric threshold selected from this process, then natural background would govern. That would be consistent with of beneficial uses for that body of water. And natural background, not just upstream background. So, for example, if a groundwater basin were naturally high in arsenic, and perhaps even higher than the drinking water standard, the water boards would not necessarily enforce the drinking water standard in that groundwater aquifer. Instead, they would require that the natural background level, not be exceeded. So we're going to interpret narrative water quality objectives with numeric limits from by various organizations and agencies, and from the peer-reviewed literature. Where do we find these? Let's look at each of the main narrative water quality objectives and look at what particular numeric thresholds are available for interpreting those. The constituents objective, remember, says that we can't have chemicals in concentrations that would adversely affect beneficial uses. So the drinking water standards come into play for those waters that are designated as municipal or domestic supply in the basin plans. Those from an organization that used to be called the Department of Health Services, now the California Department of Public Health. There are primary drinking water MCLs that are based on human health concerns, secondary drinking water standards based on human welfare, usually taste or odors. There are a number of other factors that are used in developing drinking water MCLs based on facts like technology limitations or economic limitations. Is it possible to analyze for that chemical in drinking water down to the health-based or human welfare-based level? If not, then the analytical quantitation limit might be substituted for the health-based concentration or welfare-based concentration as the drinking water MCL. So other factors do come into play, and so drinking water standards aren't necessarily purely health or welfare-based in some circumstances. California drinking water standards are required to be lower, at least low or lower, than federal drinking water standards. This is pursuant to federal and state safe drinking water laws. So if the federal government lowers its drinking water standard, then California has a certain number of months or years to lower its standard to be at least as low as the new federal standard. Because water boards are protecting not only existing uses of water, but future uses as well, if the federal government lowers its MCL lower than a California MCL, then that federal MCL would be an indicator of how stringent eventual California MCLs will be. And that number could be used to interpret the narrative chemical constituents objective by the regional water boards. Another document that can be helpful in determining what concentrations of chemicals could interfere with the use of water to irrigate crops or livestock, and that's Water Quality for Agriculture, published by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Another useful document here is Water Quality Criteria, published many years ago by the State Water Board, the prime authors McGee and Wolf. In that document you can find, for example, concentrations of constituents that might interfere with the industrial use of water, for example, in an industrial boiler. Okay. Toxicity objective. Remember, the toxicity objective says no toxic chemicals in toxic amounts, or no detrimental physiological responses in the organisms involved with the beneficial use of the water. So public health goals published by the State Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment can be used to make this interpretation for waters that are sources of drinking water. These are purely health-based levels that do not include technological or economic considerations. They're purely what concentration would cause a detrimental physiological response in water if people were to drink that water. The government has similar levels called maximum contaminant level goals, or MCL goals. For chemicals that are carcinogens, USPA publishes MCL goals at 0, which would be a reasonable level in California for interpreting our narrative water quality objectives. So the 0 MCL goals rarely would be used to interpret the narrative toxicity objective. However, for chemicals that are not carcinogens, the MCL goals may be a good benchmark for what a detrimental physiological response level might be in drinking water. The Department of Public Health also publishes notification levels or action levels for chemicals that don't yet have drinking water or MCLs. Again, based usually on health concerns for that chemical in drinking water. There's also a database maintained by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency called IRIS, the Integrated Risk Information System, and that's available online, USDA/IRIS. It provides a number of numeric criteria that can be used to determine what is the concentration in drinking water that could adversely affect human health. A number of other cancer risk-based estimates in drinking water published by the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment in California and the National Academy of Sciences. Drinking health advisories are also published by U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the National Academy of Sciences, again providing numeric thresholds above which there may be a concern for human health if that water were to be consumed. Set of levels that are published in California under Proposition 65. This is a statute that requires a number of things, of which is that carcinogens and reproductive toxins in significant amounts are not discharged to sources of drinking water. The statute provides that the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment can publish what are called regulatory levels for carcinogens and reproductive toxins, above which there would be a problem under Prop 65. Carcinogens, OEHA uses the 100,000 risk level, which is different than the 1 in a million risk level normally used for drinking water standard development and other drinking water criteria. For reproductive toxins, they go in the opposite direction. They first start with the no observed adverse effect level and then divide that by 1,000 to give the regulatory level under Prop 65. The intent of this statute was, as I mentioned, a number of things. First, to prohibit the discharge of carcinogens and reproductive toxins to sources of drinking water. Also, to make sure the public are notified prior to exposing them to these chemicals in the environment. The intent of this statute was not to establish safe levels in drinking water. So I advise that the 65 regulatory levels not used to interpret the toxicity objective in California in most cases, unless there are no other thresholds available. National recommended water quality criteria published by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency under the Clean Water Act. These are advisory levels for either human health protection or aquatic life protection from chemicals in water. For health protection, they assume that people would be ingesting the water and eating aquatic life, fish and shellfish, harvested from the water. For those that are not sources of drinking water, they simply assume consumption of fish and shellfish. They apply surface waters only for this reason and are not to be used for interpreting the narrative toxicity objective for groundwater, but very useful for interpreting the narrative toxicity objective for surface water with respect to human toxicity or aquatic life toxicity. There are a number of pesticides that don't have other recommended levels in water that are published in the literature. And so the California Department of Fish and Game has contracted with the California Department of Pesticide Regulation to develop aquatic life protective limits called pesticide hazard assessments. They're also published on the internet. They are developed using the same procedures that the US EPA uses to push the National Recommended Water Quality Criteria. So there are a number of chemicals that have these pesticide hazard assessments that can be used, again, to interpret the narrative toxicity objective with respect to aquatic life protection. For taste and odors, there are secondary drinking water MCLs, most of which are based on adverse taste or odors of these chemicals in drinking water. California Department of Public Health and US EPA both publish secondary drinking water MCLs. In National Recommended Water Quality Criteria, the US EPA also publishes what they call organoleptic thresholds, concentrations of chemicals in water that would cause adverse tastes or odors if those levels are more stringent than toxicity-based levels. Another source of thresholds used to interpret the narrative taste and odors objective. See, in the drinking water health advisory documents, we find organoleptic thresholds that can be used to interpret the narrative taste and odors objective. And taste and odor thresholds published by US EPA and many other organizations in the peer-reviewed literature. The accomplishment of water quality goals and an online database has put a lot of these different numeric thresholds together for you in one easy-to-locate location. And here is the web address to find the water quality goals staff report and the online searchable database, and a number of other tools to help you with interpreting our water quality standards in California. So I'm going to give you a demonstration of where to find those documents and the database. I'll be looking now at the State Water Resources Control Board's homepage on the Internet. The address is www.waterboards.c.gov. The water quality assessment link in the white area on the right-hand side of the home page. On that, bring the area of the website under which you find a link to a collation of water quality goals. This includes the staff report that I mentioned, which covers the content of this webinar in much more detail. In addition, there is a searchable database of over 860 chemical constituents and water quality parameters with numeric thresholds from various locations in the literature and other agencies and organizations. So click that link, brings to the Water Quality Goals website. The different kinds of numeric thresholds are found in collation of water quality goals. On a bit, you see some old language that makes our attorneys happy, and also cautions people that you need to carefully review the information in the staff report in order to correctly use that you'll find in the database. There to the search page to begin a search under the Basin. I'll show you that in a little bit. There's also a tutorial here on how to use the online water quality goals database. I made a staff report that explains all of this that you can download and review. In addition, very recently I provided a much more extensive course on this topic, and there are videos on this course from here on the website that you can review at your leisure, and then also for that course and the PowerPoint presentations. So online visual demonstrations of how to use the database included here. A little further, and an abbreviated table of assessment thresholds. The table derived from the Water Quality Goals database, listing a number of numeric thresholds used by water boards in determining whether water bores are impaired for their beneficial uses or not. A little down are lists that allow you to download the contents of the database if you want to use that information offline. The threshold tables, the footnotes, and the references can all be downloaded as tab-delimited text files. There's also a data dictionary that tells you what the contents of those downloaded files are intended to be. When information in the database is updated, a list is made in these update documents shown here. If you receive information about water quality goals as things are updated, there is a link to allow you to get on our mailing list. Now, do that if you'd like to follow this information in the future. And contact information is provided at the bottom of the page. Back up again. One of the pieces of information is provided here in bold is the last update date of the Water Quality Goals database. September 9th of 2011 was last update. There's going to be another update occurring this summer that will incorporate anything that has been published more recently than September 9th of 2011. To update this database at least once a year, hopefully frequently in the future. The search page link and show you how the database itself works. On the search page link, I come to a very simple interactive for the database. There's a box in which you can type name of the chemical that you're interested in, or an abbreviation for that chemical, or one of its synonyms, or the chemical abstract service registry number for that chemical. I'm going to type in copper and click the Submit button. So what the search engine does is it looks through the database, all of the names of the chemicals, the chemical abstract service registry numbers, and the synonyms, and provides anything that matches what you typed in the search box. Two different constituents came up, copper and copper cyanide. I'm going to click on copper to see what numeric thresholds are in the database for copper. So what up with is a table that lists the different kinds of of numeric thresholds down the left-hand side, and then information about those thresholds to the right. We have California's drinking water maximum contaminant levels, the MCLs and secondary MCLs, and then US EPA's drinking water MCLs, the primary MCLs, secondary MCLs, and MCL goals. For our California's public health goals, these are, again, pretty health-based criteria for concentrations of chemicals in drinking water that would be associated with an adverse health effect. California notification levels by the state public health department for chemicals that don't yet have drinking water maximum contaminant levels. Health advisories and related levels are also presented here. But further down, I'm going to explain the rest of the table. Also under sources and references, you'll notice that the major headings are blue and underlined. That links. If you click on them, comes a description of that particular kind of numeric threshold, who uses it, how it's derived, where it's found on the internet. There are direct links to find the primary sources of these numeric thresholds and explanatory information. The next columns of the table present the numeric thresholds that are in those documents for the particular chemical that we're looking at, in the case copper. Primary drinking water MCL of 1,300 micrograms per liter. There are two columns, threshold 1 and threshold 2, because sometimes there is a particular threshold that's in the literature, and that organization has published to revise it to another level. So column 2 might show the draft concentration that is published for that proposed change. Sometimes there is a range. For example, if we're looking at pH, there would be a range of concentrations, a range of pH levels. For example, 6.5 to 8.5 to protect aquatic organisms. So the 6.5 would be in the threshold 1 column, the 8.5 in the threshold 2 column. The relationship between the thresholds in threshold 1 and threshold 2 would be explained in a footnote. Footnotes are further to the right. There are two columns for footnotes. Notice footnotes are blue and underlined. They're also live links. Clicking footnote gives you more explanatory information about the particular thresholds that are presented in that row of the database. The thresholds in the database are micrograms per liter, parts per billion, unless there is a different unit provided in the units column. For notes, I'll show you where that comes into play a little further down in this column, in this spreadsheet. Again, the footnotes columns. I've been adding adoption dates for the thresholds that are presented here, so you can see what is more recent. A couple of columns that provide information about what would be the most limiting thresholds to protect certain beneficial uses of water. I'll show you those in more detail a little bit later. Further down in the sheet for copper, there are a number of risk estimates from CAP's Cancer Potency Factor database, those from US EPA's IRIS database, from Health Advisories, and from the National Academy of Sciences. At the Prop C5 safe harbor levels that I mentioned, no significant risk levels for carcinogens, and maximum allowable dose levels for reproductive toxins. Further down, we have taste and odor thresholds from the literature by agricultural water quality goals, again from that publication of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Notice that for copper, there is a threshold here of 200 micrograms per liter, indicating that above that level there may be adverse effects either on crops irrigated with that water or livestock. We have the California Toxics Rule and National Toxics Rule criteria. First, for inland surface waters, human space levels, the freshwater aquatic life-based concentrations. Notice when we look at the freshwater aquatic life criteria in the California Toxics Rule, we have both a 4-day average and a 1-hour average. They both apply. And on this column, there is a link. See page 32. For copper, these criteria vary with the hardness of the water. The water, the more copper is associated in chemical complexes, making that copper less toxic to aquatic organisms. So we know the hardness level to interpret the criteria. Well, there's a spreadsheet available to you with this link. If I click on this page 32 link, I'm asked to open Excel. And comes a spreadsheet that presents the criteria for copper based on various hardness levels in the left-hand column. We all have the Toxics Rule criteria, the 4-day average and 1-hour average concentrations to the right of that, either as dissolved or total recoverable concentrations. A little further to the right, you'll see a graph that graphs out those criteria with hardness being along the bottom axis and the criteria up the y-axis on the left-hand side. And the formulas used to derive those particular criteria are presented in the legend box within the graph. So directly how those criteria vary with hardness. And by the way, the criteria formulas are plugged into the spreadsheet portion of this table. If you had a hardness value that was somewhat different than the values that are presented on the left-hand side of the table, you could type in the hardness that you had. Let's say I had a hardness in the water that I mentioned of 72 milligrams per liter at calcium carbonate. I could type that in, click enter, and the criteria to the right of that would calculate based on that new hardness level. Quite information provided for you here. So I'm going to out this particular spreadsheet. You could save it to your desktop if you wanted to use that spreadsheet later. I'm not going to save it now. Go back to the Water Quality Goals database. Going further down the table, I have, again, California Toxics Rule criteria, this time that apply to enclosed bays and estuaries of California. So again, there are human health protective values in case only considering fish consumption, because enclosed bays and estuaries are not usually sources of drinking water. And we have aquatic life protective values, in this case, the saltwater protective criteria. For waters in California, we have another water quality control plan, the California Ocean Plan, that provides enforceable numeric water quality objectives for many constituents and parameters in California's ocean waters. So here we see human health protective criteria if they exist for the chemical we're looking at in the document. Also, marine aquatic life protective values at a number of averaging periods. Going to the plan criteria, we'll find national recommended water quality criteria. These are the advisory levels that U.S. EPA publishes under the Clean Water Act for human health protection and aquatic life protection for chemicals in our surface waters. So we have human health protective values in water plus fish consumption for our sources of drinking water, or fish consumption only for our waters that are not sources of drinking water. And then we have freshwater aquatic life protective values and saltwater aquatic life protective values. We have of notes that various entries in the table. Here, the different entries in the right-hand columns, the limiting threshold columns, are presented for you here to interpret what's in the data for those. All the footnotes for this particular chemical are repeated at the bottom. So if you were to print out this particular spreadsheet, you'd also get the footnotes that are cited for this particular chemical. So in the Water Quality Goals database, this point, I'm going to return back to my presentation. I see a number of questions that have come up, and we'll try to handle those at the very end of the presentation. I don't have a whole lot more to present to you today. There are a lot of different thresholds in the Water Quality Goals database for each particular constituent or parameter that you may be concerned about in water. You select the most appropriate ones. A number of algorithms have been produced that help you walk through methods to select the most defensible numbers to use to interpret negative water quality objectives, also apply the numeric water quality objectives and numeric criteria for US EPA under the national and California Toxics rules. Selecting a water quality limit should be defensible. Quality limit should be chosen to apply each applicable water quality objective and promulgated water quality criteria under the CTR and NTR. The term assessment threshold is used for the most stringent of those limits that would apply all relevant standards to that constituent in that body of water. And the algorithms help you to select an assessment threshold for the chemical of interest in a particular body of water. Algorithms each have three main steps: selecting a numeric threshold to satisfy each applicable water quality objective and promulgated criterion, or report of that criterion or objective. And then step 2, to satisfy all of these objectives, the lowest threshold selected from the first step would be chosen as the assessment threshold. In step 3, if a correction upward for higher natural background levels in the water body, that correction would be done in step 3. Principles for selecting those initial thresholds to interpret each objective and promulgated criterion. Because the objectives are based on risk to beneficial uses, risk-based thresholds rather than risk management-based thresholds are most appropriate to implement the negative water quality objectives. For example, looking at the toxicity objective that says no toxic chemicals at toxic amounts. Purely toxicity-based limits would be the most appropriate to use to interpret that narrative toxicity objective, rather than a risk management-based limit that includes other factors that may not be relevant to protecting beneficial uses of our water resources. So, for example, risk management-based limits may contain information or constraints that apply to another regulatory scheme, not the Water Board's scheme to protect beneficial uses of our surface waters and groundwaters. Management-based levels are not as useful as purely risk-based levels. Also, a preference in the algorithms for California published criteria and guidelines and standards, in those developed by the federal government or other sources. And we're trying to be consistent among our California agencies. So, for example, if the State Health Department has published a regulatory level or an advisory level, we'd rather use that than a level published for the similar purpose from another agency like US EPA or another state. So we make sure that the numeric thresholds that we're selecting reflect peer-reviewed science. So avoid using draft or provisional thresholds unless nothing else is available. And when you use draft or provisional thresholds, you need to go back to the original source to get that source agency to help you to interpret the use of that particular threshold and to defend its use for the particular purpose that you're going to use it. I'll make sure that the thresholds you're selecting reflect current science. As I mentioned, we've tried to establish or tried to publish the adoption dates for each of the thresholds in the Water Quality Goal database to help you determine what is more recent. Ensure that the limits that you're using are relevant to interpreting the particular standard that you're interpreting. So compare the language of the narrative draft object or the narrative objective with how that particular threshold has been derived. Are they consistent? Also, looking at exposure routes. For example, we would not want to use a health-based criterion that is based on the ingestion of fish and shellfish from water if we're looking at protecting human health from concentrations of chemicals in groundwater where we don't have fish and shellfish. There are 4 different algorithms in the Water Quality Goals staff report, and I'll leave you to look at those and their details. 13th edition of Water Quality Goals, published in 2003, included algorithms for groundwater and surface waters. The latest edition of Water Quality Goals, the 16th edition in 2011, included additional algorithms for enclosed bays and estuaries and ocean waters. Again, to help you select numeric assessment thresholds based on our water quality standards in a defensible manner. At this point, that's the end of my presentation, and look to see what we have in the way of questions. At the chat, first of all, I see a question. If 0 is not a part of this, then how can the state say no to drop weather flow whatsoever? Not understanding how to interpret that question. What I'm trying to say was that under California regulations and statutes, the water boards don't have the authority to require that natural background concentrations of chemicals be improved upon. So, for example, I gave the example of a groundwater aquifer that might naturally have high concentrations of arsenic, maybe higher than the drinking water standard. The water boards don't have the authority to say that that groundwater aquifer must be cleaned up or improved upon if the concentration of the arsenic in that groundwater is natural, if the concentration itself is from natural sources. That's trying to get across. Second question, how are Basin Plan and Ocean Plan water quality standards developed, as I've not been able to find evidence of scientific peer review of the standards? Who has determined, other than the state and regional water boards, that these limits are in fact scientifically appropriate? Actually, California regulations and the that you find in the water quality control plans, or Basin plans, are California regulations. All California regulations, scientific basis for those regulations is required to be peer-reviewed, scientifically peer-reviewed. So the basis for new water quality objectives adopted by the state water board or a regional water board is required to go through formal scientific peer review to adoption of those new water quality objectives. And the record of decision for adopting that standard would include that scientific peer review. Normally, the peer review information is published on the Internet as those standards are being developed. Okay, another question. Table B of the Ocean Plan has water quality standards that are lower than drinking water standards. Has the Ocean Plan been designated as a drinking water supply? Well, no. The ocean waters of California are not drinking water supplies. They do have a number of other beneficial uses that must be protected. We have to make sure the aquatic organisms in ocean waters are protected from harmful effects of chemicals. And so the Ocean Plan contains a number of marine aquatic life water quality objectives for that purpose. In addition, those fish and shellfish that people eat can accumulate pollutants from the water and pose a threat to humans that might eat fish or shellfish gathered from our ocean waters. And some of the water quality objectives adopted in the Ocean Plan are to prevent those kinds of adverse effects. So those are two of the kinds of examples of water quality objectives that you find in Table B of the Ocean Plan. Those are necessarily lower than drinking water maximum contaminant levels. Long question here. You spoke of natural background as it being the most stringent, but many constituents in Malibu Creek watershed are at highest concentrations in natural headwaters and dilute in the downstream direction through developed areas. Yes, that's a good point. We have to look at natural background in the particular location in the water body. So in Malibu Creek and other kinds of waters, you may find that if you're up higher in the watershed where the source minerals for those constituents are present, that you might have higher concentrations of those minerals in water. As it moves downstream, there are tributaries coming into that main water body from other areas that may have lower concentrations of those minerals, diluting out the natural concentration. So natural background level at one location in Malibu Creek might be different than it is at another location. And so the interpretation of natural background is site-specific. See, the goes on to state multiple standards for TDS, sulfate, and selenium that are actually elevated from geologic sources in these headwaters. Yes, that's true. There's evidence for that, at least that I have read in the literature. What would be appropriate course of action, for example, to change the planned sulfate standard so that national high concentrations in protected, undeveloped waters be recognized and downstream permit holders aren't held to unattainable standards. Well, I mentioned the natural background level is interpreted location-specific. If the natural background level at a particular location in the water is higher than the water quality objective in the Basin plan, then a person that is impacted by that would apply to the Regional Water Board and ask them to adopt a site-specific water quality objective, recognizing that higher natural concentration in that particular location. But again, it would be a site-specific determination that the Regional Board would make in adopting a site-specific water quality objective. So there might be a different objective adopted in one location in the water body versus another level where that natural mineralization had been diluted out by succeeding tributaries further down in the watershed. Requesting a site-specific objective is the method to get that situation corrected. And the question, a simple administrative change in the Basin Plan water quality objectives. It's not an administrative change. Adopting a new objective would require action, a formal regulatory action by the regional water boards. The question ends with, how do you determine natural background? Well, what we're trying to determine here is what's the concentration of the particular constituent that would naturally be present in the water body at that location in the absence of any activities of man. So if, for example, there was activities upstream in the watershed that liberated more of those minerals into the water, then would naturally be there because, for example, development, housing, or other purposes. That would not be a natural concentration. So we may need to go back and look at older information to help us determine what the undisturbed natural background concentration was in that water at that location. There may be adjacent water bodies that we could look at as an analogous situation, a water body that's not been impacted by activities of man or discharges of waste that has similar geology, for example, to tell us what a natural background concentration might be in the water body of concern. With questions. Eric, do we have more time?
We have time for 2, maybe 3 questions. If you've already submitted your chat, we have them queued up for John. If you haven't, please send questions directly to John after the presentation because we won't have the time to address those.
Okay. Go on with those that have been submitted by chat. How can we monitor successful water quality improvements for low impact development, permeable pavement? The goal is lack of surface water runoff, I think is what you're trying to say here. Or, can measure constituents. Not clear on what this is saying. We recommend online courses to delve into monitoring for low-impact development success criteria. Well, you may know low-impact development are various methods that are used in order to help retain stormwater on site and allow it to percolate into the subsurface rather than running off into our surface water bodies where it may carry various pollutants. So measuring the success of those, my talk today did not talk about monitoring methods. That I'm covering today is what concentrations of chemicals in a water body might violate one or more of our water quality standards. So this question is a bit off topic, and I'm going to have to leave that for someone else to answer.
We have those resources online on the webpage. They were handed in the last non-pointers conference as a separate workshop. That was maybe set 5 years ago. So whoever submitted that question follows up with me. This is Eric Burris. I will help you get the resources that you need.
Terrific. Thanks, Eric.
Yeah.
The next one, again, talking about maybe a natural source of a particular constituent of concern. Since bats are protected species, would an agency have to address the bacterial levels, for example, fecal coliform, attributable to those bats to address MCLs? Well, it's on how the MCLs are used. If, again, there is a natural concentration of bacteria, fecal coliform, in water from a purely natural source, the water boards wouldn't necessarily require that natural concentration be improved upon. So if it could be documented, for example, that in a particular location the bacterial levels were due to wildlife that normally live in that area, then the water boards may not choose to correct that problem. So that's what I'm getting at in my remarks. Question, California nutrient levels, nitrogen and phosphorus for lakes are established lower than potable water currently used to replenish the lakes, and those prevent use of recycled water. Phosphorus are difficult constituents to manage in our surface waters. It's not very easy to relate the concentration of nitrogen or phosphorus in water to where there's been a beneficial use impact. And there is a very extensive effort at both the state and federal levels to come up with a policy for how to regulate nutrients in water to prevent harmful effects, not only on humans, but also on aquatic life that live in those waters. If we have too much nitrogen or phosphorus in those waters, we can get eutrophication effects, algal blooms that can adversely affect wildlife, aquatic life, and or human health, and so beneficial uses can be harmed. So there is, as I mentioned, an effort at the state level in our water quality standards development, and also at the federal level. Both the U.S. Geologic Survey and the U.S. EPA are developing methods for interpreting what concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus in water might be harmful to these uses of water. So stay tuned. There is information on the State Water Board's website. If you search for nutrient criteria, you will find information there. Question I have on the chat: how is the natural background considered for water quality objectives from storm events? Can water quality objectives be corrected upward for storm events? Question. That's pretty complicated. I'm not sure I've got the definitive answer for you here, but I'll make an attempt. If a event mobilizes constituents of concern into our surface waters and causes certain water quality concentrations to be elevated because of those, that might be interpreted as a natural background concentration by the Regional Water Board. Enforcement might not be an issue. But if the concentrations of pollutants that storm event caused to get into that water are any way related to human activities, then that would not be a natural background consideration. and enforcement of our water quality standard would be an appropriate response by a regional water board. That's questions I see in the chat, and I think we're probably out of time this morning. If you go back to the water quality goals page on the water board website, you can see my contact information at the bottom of the screen. Feel free to email me or call me with your additional questions or comments.